All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Brooks Raiford, President and CEO of NC Tech, and I want to welcome you to this briefing on the release of our quarterly leadership poll. Building off some spot polling that we did during the early months of COVID, we launched in 2022 a quarterly poll that asks some consistent questions about general business sentiment, like on hiring, growth, and so forth, as well as some questions that might rotate in or out based on current events or issues or areas of interest to our audience. The final quarterly poll of 2023 was conducted within the last week, and we're releasing the results today. You'll find this on our website at nctech.org/pulse. We polled about just under 400 people and had a 42% response rate, so quite good response. The respondents are members of our board of directors, our board of advisors, CEOs of North Carolina tech companies, and leaders of large tech hubs or sites within North Carolina, but that are not headquartered here. Our sponsoring partner since the inception of these polls has been the Stearns Financial Group. Their founder, Dennis Stearns, serves on the NC Tech Board of Advisors and joins me today. And he gets a special shout out because for those of you watching us live, he's on family vacation and carved out time to be with us. So welcome, Dennis.
Yeah, thank you, Brooks. I'm glad to be here. And I think this particular polling brought up some interesting tidbits. So looking forward to going through it.
Me too. It has been interesting. And this is the year end, so we have a full year's worth to look at. And I'll be commenting on some of the questions that have been consistently asked about some of the shifts and so on that we have seen. So thank you again for making the time to be with us. And I'm very happy to share with everyone that Dennis's firm has committed to remain our poll sponsor in 2024. So thank you, Dennis, for that as well.
You're welcome.
Great. All right, I'll begin to walk through the slides, and so we can go to the first one. The first few questions are really just for demographic purposes. We ask what range best depicts the number of North Carolina-based employees are in your organization. You can see the distribution there, fairly even distribution throughout. I will say that the respondents, or the polled audience tends to skew a little bit larger in terms of their employee count in North Carolina than our overall membership base does. Overall in NC Tech, our members, the vast majority of them are medium to small companies or firms that have 50 or fewer employees in North Carolina. But you can see this skews a bit larger, not too surprising since it focuses on leaders in our system. Next. And here we go. We ask if the organization that the person is representing is headquartered in North Carolina. You can see that this holds pretty consistent each time, about 2/3 yes, about 1/3 no. And that really tracks actually very accurately with our overall membership, which is nearly 700 companies, organizations, and institutions. Next. And then lastly, on the demographic side, we try to get a flavor for who's answering the poll. And you see we very much skew towards C-suite. This is pretty typical. It tends to hover plus or minus 60% on that. And you can see it sort of stair steps down from there. But this gives you a flavor of the role, the functional role that people have who are responding to the poll. All right, next. So now we'll get into some of the content questions. This first one is about how do you perceive the past quarter for North Carolina's tech sector broadly? You'll see in the next slide that we bifurcate this question a bit. We ask, how do you feel the sector has done? And then how do you feel your own organization has done? And there's a phenomenon here that has happened again, which I'll touch on. But you see here that very few say terrible. About 8.5%, 9% say slightly disappointing. A large chunk, 41%, say okay, just okay. 44% say good, and about 6% say great. And I will share with you that if you looked at the 4 quarters this year, when this question was asked starting back in Q1, the very small percent that say terrible has remained almost exactly the same, 1 to 2% each time. Slightly disappointing actually went down this quarter. It has held remarkably steady at around 12% each previous quarter, and down to 9%. Okay has held pretty steady from beginning to end. Q1, 42% said okay, 41% this time. The intervening quarters over the summer actually dipped about 7 or 8 points on this one. And that dip was because people were moving from good down to okay in the middle of the year. But I think, Dennis, that's because maybe there was still a lot of concern about recession and uncertainty that has abated a bit in this most recent quarter. In fact, this poll was taken sort of in the heat of the news that many of those who follow such things, including the Fed, have minimized what they perceive to be the risk of recession in our future. What do you think?
Well, I agree. And our top three research outfits have all been dropping their predictions for an overall recession in 2024. They're now averaging about a 12% probability, so not impossible, but pretty low. But I think the thing that a lot of our NC Tech folks are recognizing is that just because the national economy isn't in a official recession, folks they deal with in different sectors have been going through rolling recessions. So yes, depending on where your customer is, it's possible you're experiencing the effect of a rolling recession, even if you're not in official recession.
That's exactly right. I guess the old saying of where you stand depends on where you sit, or maybe I'm saying that backwards, but everyone's circumstance or every sector's circumstance can be different from others. And the tech sector tends to be a higher performing one broadly. Alex, we'll move to the next slide. So this is where we ask about people's perception of their own organization. You'll see that terrible still is quite low, slightly disappointing around that 10% mark. Okay, 23, good 47, and great 17. So people, this happens every time, Dennis. People tend to have a perception that the sector might be they're cautious in their answer on that one, but their own organization seems to be higher performing in their mind than the sector at large. I wonder what's the psychology behind that, I wonder.
Well, their own children are brighter and have a better future. I also think it's interesting that technology as a whole, depending on which sector our members are in, their prospects may be a little better or a little worse. But there's a lot of money now being spent on upping the game in technology. And so that's all good. The thing that our members do report is there's increasing competition and within the tech sector itself. So kind of a bit of a headwind and a tailwind there.
Well, and if you look at the year on this question, terrible has remained very low across the board. The main shift was we began the year with 17% saying slightly disappointing, and that's gone down. Well, it went down a little bit in Q2, held steady in Q3, went down again, notably in Q4 to 10%. So where did those people go? They moved into the okay category, or actually the good category went up 37% at the beginning of the year to 47% now. Okay has held around 23 to 25% throughout. And then great has been very consistent. It began the year at 19. It's been 17 every quarter since then. All right, next slide. Now we ask people to look ahead. I ask people to look ahead a little bit. I expect that over the next quarter, our business will decline, stay the same, or grow. We have seen this general pattern throughout. Decline is very minimal. Stay the same as a minority, but a substantial one of the respondents, but still overwhelmingly optimistic. And Dennis, before I ask you to comment on that, I'll quickly share the trend line there. The beginning of this year, those who said the business would decline was 6%, and then it went down to 1%. So that's a really good improvement. Stay the same, declined. 32%, 33% is where it's held all year. in this quarter, that went down to 21, and all those people moved into the grow category. Began the year at around 62 to 66% saying grow. Now it's 78% grow. So this is the optimism question, and it's remarkable to me that there was that big of a shift. There normally isn't that large of one.
Yeah, and that tracks with some of the CEO surveys of public companies, where many of the CEOs of public companies really weren't sure with all the crosswinds earlier this year, back to a comment you made, Brooks, that we were going to thread the needle and get through all the record Federal Reserve interest rate increases and all the other issues we had, that we were going to thread the needle and get out the other end in decent shape. And they have now been moving a bit more optimistic, and that's very consistent with our poll, our Ninja research poll of private companies. Same exact trend. It was a bit more skeptical earlier in the year about where we were going, and now it's gotten more positive, more optimistic.
Well, that's encouraging to hear all the way around. Okay, we can move on to the next
one. They're
one.
all right.
That's exactly right. Here we ask about hiring. We give them three options. Are you reducing your headcount on a net basis? Are you just sort of holding steady? Or are you still hiring? This general distribution has held steady all year, meaning very little reduction. A significant minority, but still a minority, saying not hiring, and a majority saying hiring. On this one, the trend has been as follows. Beginning of the year, reducing headcount was at 6%. It dipped to 4% for the next two quarters and now down to 2%. So the trend there has been less and less in net reduction of headcount among our respondents. The not hiring has grown, though. It began the year around 28%, ticked up to 31% in Q2, 34% in Q3, and now here you see 36%. So really, the not hiring has grown some at the expense of hiring. At the beginning of the year, 67% were still hiring. That dipped to 65, then 62, and then it repeated at 62 this quarter. So there has been some moderation on the hiring front, but overall, still a pretty robust visual here, considering some of what you read in the press. What are you seeing, Dennis?
Yeah, well, I think the issues that many companies, public and private, are having with their profit margins getting pressure might not be to the point of squeezing yet, but it's getting there. Has convinced many organizations that they need to tap the brakes, and so maybe they would have hired 6 people to deal with growth in the coming year, and maybe they'll only hire 3, and they'll try to be a little bit more lean and efficient. And again, the changing recession numbers and are things good or great going forward? There seems to be a little bit of let up on that, but there's still a lot of organizations that aren't hiring as robustly as perhaps they might have. But then within NC Tech, we have some super growth companies. We have some companies that are just exploding in their growth, and they can't find enough workers still. I mean, it's getting better than it was a year ago. So it's a very mixed bag, but I guess the good news is majority are still hiring.
Well, I was sparked by a news article, or actually a column written recently, I think last week, by Michael Walden, who is the William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor at NC State University, an economist there, who's widely quoted and widely well regarded in his prognostications. And he has come out with his 2024 outlook, and he projects that he calls it a tale of two economies, that in the first half, there will be some of the hesitancy that you were talking about, people tapping the brake perhaps a little bit, and that we'll see that. But he expects the second half of the year to come roaring back in a pretty strong fashion. So rather than saying the year as a whole will be, conservative or concerning or fully robust, he kind of predicts a pattern there that sees about a mid-year pivot. So I posted a very unscientific LinkedIn poll to see what people thought about that. Are you pessimistic about the next year? Do you agree with Dr. Walden, or are you optimistic about next year overall? And the responses have been overwhelmingly optimistic, or that was by far the most common answer. Agree with him was the next most common, and very few said pessimistic. So I hope that's a good sign.
Yeah, now Brooks, my grandmother did teach me that when everybody thinks something's going to happen, it'll usually be something else. So you're starting to make me a little nervous.
Well, we will see. We will see. Hopefully, a lot of those who are answering these questions are the ones also making some of these decisions. So that's also encouraging.
Well, I was going to say we're dealing with, I think, a more informed
Yeah,
audience in some of these surveys. So that's good.
I think that's fair. That's fair. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the part where we often will throw in a question. In this case, it's a pair of questions on a topic that's been recommended. When we do these polls, we ask, is there a question you'd like us to consider including next time? And interestingly, way back in 2020, Dennis, when we did these snap polls in the advent of COVID, and no one had any idea how long it would last, and then certainly into, excuse me, 2021, when the vaccines started to become available at the end of 2020 and into 2021, lots of discussion about workplace policies, work from anywhere, work from the office, hybrid, all those terms became part of our vocabulary again. And so we haven't really asked that question or questions like that for a while, but it's the most common thing I get asked. What are you hearing? What are your member companies doing? Does it depend on their size? All that kind of thing. And it was far and away the most common request that we ask again about. And as you can imagine, it's hard to ask these questions in a perfect way that satisfies everybody's interest, because one person's or one company's definition of hybrid will vary from another. And employee choice in that can vary depending on the organization as well. So the first question here is, which of the following most closely represents your employer's requirement or expectation for working in the office? You'll see that the smallest percentage is requiring that 100% of the time that 100% of the employees work in the office. So barely 9% have that situation. And then you see about a quarter say there's no requirement. It doesn't mean that no one's in the office. It means there's no requirement about it. Next up, you've got 33% that say less than 50% of time in the office. So that could be a couple of days a week in, several out. And then another third-ish say that 50% or more in the office. That could be a 3 days in, 2 days out kind of model. But I was interested in this distribution. It's kind of a third almost of the three main categories that I think most of us witness, which are there's no requirement, there's hybrid, but you're mostly in, and there's hybrid, but you can be mostly out. Dennis, in our pre-conversation, you observed that even within the respondents of this poll, probably that small piece of the pie is where maybe some financial services firms like yours and others are closer to that as their standard. What are you seeing?
Well, there certainly are a lot of other sectors of the economy that have gone back to everybody in the office, trying to make sure that all the cultural pieces, the connect the dots that you get when you happen to rub elbows with somebody next to you, which, by the way, was a Steve Jobs piece way back in the day. He even designed his offices so that there was more elbow rubbing and cross fertilization of ideas. And so a lot of other industries are doing that. The tech industry does seem to be staying out there on the leading edge, and we're using more tech tools now to try to duplicate that rubbing of elbows, instantaneous getting together and flash ideas. Jury's still out. I mean, this is going to be a long-term experiment of which works the best. And it may, we've gotten feedback in the past. A lot may happen to deal with the mix of your business and what kind of sector you're in and your expectations of customers and all that sort of thing. So,
to be sure, absolutely. So there's as I mentioned, a question that we paired with this. If we'll go to that slide. Which of the following most closely represents your employer's policy regarding work flexibility? Very few have no flexibility, as you see here. The next lowest is low flexibility, meaning there's some, but not a lot. Moderate is a pretty large chunk, so is high. And I think fairly high total to be nearly 20% saying employee choice, no expectations or requirements. That was probably a bit higher than I was anticipating. I would have anticipated the moderate to high, which is the bulk of the responses, to be maybe even a larger chunk of this pie. Dennis, you have anything further to say on that?
Well, I do think that we're in a completely new era of a lot of employers need their employees more than the employees need them.
Mhm.
And the very tight labor markets, the ability of knowledge workers in particular to jump from company to company if their current company isn't giving them flexibility. And flexibility has regularly been said to be one of the top three things that employees are looking for. So again, this one will be interesting as we go forward, and particularly if the labor market gets a little looser. Will companies change the way they're doing things? I don't know that most of them can. I mean, the toothpaste is out of the tube, as they say, and so workforces are enjoying some of the flexibility
Right.
that they've got.
Very true. As it's been said many times, it's hard to take back something that's been given. And so it's a trick to figure out the right mix. All right,
Right.
let's move to the next. That might be the last one. Oh, that's right. We ask two questions every time that are open-ended. And so we ask uh, forward-looking, are you optimistic over the next 12 months? If so, what kind of feeds that for you? As you'll see in the next slide, we ask the opposite. But inflation coming under control, demand for services, lower rates, it being an election year, AI growth. That was one of the questions we asked last time was what's the adoption level in your organization of AI? So there still is a lot of interest around that. Investment in NC, not just state dollars, but the continued really strong economic development that's happening in North Carolina, all showed up here. Dennis, you know what I'm going to say next, which is that it's funny how some of the things that show up for some people as things they're optimistic about then show up on the next slide because others are pessimistic about those very things. Those very things drive pessimism for them. So why don't we look at that second slide and then we'll talk about it for a second. So you'll see some of the same general phrases here. Election shows up again, interest rates and inflation shows up again, economics, recession, et cetera. Domestic political uncertainty, but also global political turmoil, a lot of that going on. Talent and workforce always shows up, I think, as a concern because there's just never enough, never enough talent, even in a good economy and a thriving one like we have. I was a little surprised to see supply chain disruptions continuing to show up here. We read that a lot of that has eased, but clearly it's on the mind of some. So with those two slides, Dennis, what jumped out at you?
Well, I think the fact that there's still a lot of crosswinds, a lot of tailwinds, and a lot of headwinds sort of reflects the period of uncertainty that we're in. And so that is understandable.
Mhm.
And, there's so many things that are trumped up by the major news organizations and internet news, the scenario of disaster of the day, and if that one doesn't happen, there's a new disaster that may happen,
Right.
and so that uh, feeds into even CEO mentalities. Most people think that CEOs are above all of that, but they're consuming generally a lot of information, and so some of them makes them a little bit nervous, even if they're optimistic. And certainly in the private sector, most CEOs in our Ninja entrepreneur research, they are paranoid, just almost all the time anyway. But you know, it's not necessarily about a global recession or a global war. Most of them, it's competition, changing market environments. What do their customers want that might change in the next 12 to 24 months? So again, you know, business is a contact sport, and I think we're picking up on that consistently in these surveys.
Yeah, that that whole psychology discussion is had about individual consumer attitudes. We've talked about that before. That you've referred to the yet to arrive recession as the most predicted recession that hasn't come ever, and we've talked about the huge impact of psychology in how people behave, whether they spend or are saving or are getting really frugal with their money, and the usual pattern of behavior and attitudes just hasn't happened this time. And we continue to see some really encouraging signs like unemployment remaining low, job creation continuing, though moderating, which in the economic world seems to be a good thing in the minds of the Fed and others. So hopefully we'll see all this matched optimism between consumers and what we saw today in this poll with leaders in our sector coming to fruition in 2024. So with that, we've wrapped up the results for this final quarterly poll. We'll be back again in the spring with the first quarter of 2024. Thank you, Dennis, for the support of Stearns Financial Group, and a reminder that all of you who are viewing can find this recording on our website at nctech.org/pulse as soon as we can get the recording posted. I'll also email a link to everyone who is registered for today with the slide deck as well as the video. And so with that, for now, thank you for viewing, and we'll see you next time.